Harlan Voss didn't wait for the dirt to settle over Gideon Hartwell's grave. The marshal rode into the yard while Elowen was still holding the shovel, her black dress stiff with cold, her eyes raw from 2 days of crying she hadn't let anyone see. He pulled a folded document from his coat, like he'd been carrying it against his chest for weeks, waiting for exactly this moment, and held it out to her without dismounting. $7,400, he said. Debt owed to Cassian Rourke. Your father signed it himself. Elowen looked at the paper. She looked at the signature. Then she looked up at Harlan Voss, at his clean boots and his too easy expression. And she knew, with the same certainty she knew her own name, that her father had never held that pen. If you've never seen a woman fight an entire corrupt system with nothing but her father's ledger and the truth stay with us, subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and drop your city and country in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. Don't miss a single moment of what comes next. The morning they buried Gideon Hartwell, the temperature dropped to 12 degrees before sunrise and stayed there. Elowen had been up since 4, not because she couldn't sleep, she hadn't tried. She'd spent the night sitting at the kitchen table with her father's account books open in front of her, running her fingers along columns of numbers he'd written himself, his careful hand, the one that slanted slightly left because he'd broken 2 fingers on his right hand in '74, and they'd never healed quite straight. She wasn't reading the numbers, she just needed something to touch that was still his. The funeral was small. A preacher from Dunmore rode out to say the words, and a handful of neighboring ranchers came, men who'd traded cattle and credit with Gideon for 20 years. They stood at the gravesite with their hats in their hands, and their eyes pointed at the frozen ground, and Elowen stood beside the open earth and felt, very distinctly, the difference between people who were grieving and people who were waiting to see what happened next. Lenora stood to her left in a black wool coat that fit her perfectly, because Lenora had bought it last spring anticipating some eventual occasion. She wept with her handkerchief pressed flat against her cheekbone, not her eyes, Elowen noticed, but her cheekbone, and she received condolences from the ranchers' wives with a gracious nod that belonged more to a parlor than a cemetery. Elowen didn't weep. She'd done that alone, in the barn, the night they'd carried her father's body home from where they'd found it at the base of Cutter's Ridge. Alone in the dark, with the horses shifting and breathing around her, she had screamed once into the side of her own arm so hard she left marks. Then she'd washed her face in the water trough and gone inside and started going through his papers. She heard the hooves before she saw him. Marshal Harlan Voss rode through the gate at a pace that was not respectful, not galloping, exactly, but not the careful walk a man uses when entering a gravesite. Something in between, something that said his time was more valuable than anyone's grief. He was a tall man, lean in the way that some men are lean not from hard work, but from a metabolism that burned everything before it could settle. He wore his marshal's star on a coat that was too clean for the weather, and he had the particular bearing of someone who had learned to make his authority visible in his posture before he opened his mouth. He dismounted at the edge of the gathered mourners, and he waited. The preacher finished speaking. The ranchers began to disperse toward their horses and wagons, and that's when Voss moved crossing the frozen yard in long strides, pulling the folded document from inside his coat and holding it toward Elowen like he was doing her a favor. Miss Hartwell. He didn't call her ma'am. He'd always called her ma'am before. I'm sorry for your loss. I truly am. But there's a matter of some urgency that can't be delayed. Elowen looked at the paper. She didn't take it. What is this? Promissory note. Your father borrowed $7,400 from Cassian Rourke's cattle bank 14 months ago. Payment was due last October. Given the circumstances, he gestured vaguely at the fresh grave. Mr. Rourke has been patient, but the debt doesn't disappear because of a death. It transfers to the estate. Elowen took the document. She unfolded it carefully because her hands wanted to shake, and she would not let them. She read it slowly, not rushing, because rushing was what people expected from someone who was upset and not thinking clearly. The debt was itemized. 14 months of interest, compounded at a rate that would have been aggressive even for a city bank. The language was formal and dense, the kind of language designed to look like it couldn't be questioned. She found the signature at the bottom. She read it 3 times. Then she looked up at Voss. My father didn't sign this. Voss's expression did something complicated. It wasn't surprise. It was the practiced patience of a man who had heard this argument before and already knew how it ended. Miss Hartwell, I know my father's signature. I've been reading his handwriting since I was 8 years old. I've kept his books for the last 4 years. She held the paper up. This is not how he writes his capital G, and he never crossed his sevens. He thought it was an affectation. Grief can cause people to mince. I'm not grieving right now, Marshal. Right now, I'm reading a document. She kept her voice level with the effort of someone holding a door shut against a strong wind. This signature is forged. The remaining mourners had gone very still. Preacher found somewhere else to look. The ranchers who hadn't yet reached their horses stood with their hats in their hands and didn't speak. Lenora touched Elowen's arm. Elowen, don't. She stepped away from Lenora's hand without looking at her. Voss folded the document back with the patience of a man who has already won. I understand this is difficult, but the note has been witnessed and recorded at the county office. The legal process is already moving, and my hands are tied. He said that last part like he believed it. There are provisions in territorial law for settling estate debts when liquid assets are insufficient. Given the ranch's current situation, what situation? Her voice came out sharper than she intended. What do you know about the ranch's situation? He hesitated. Just briefly, Mr. Rourke's people have been assessing the property for valuation purposes. Cash and Rourke's people have been on this land? It's standard practice when a man dies under suspicious circumstances and somebody shows up 3 hours after the funeral with a forged promissory note. She was not yelling. She was very specifically not yelling because she understood, with the cold clarity that had been growing in her chest for 3 days, that yelling was the thing they were expecting. Yelling was the thing that would make her easy to dismiss. I want to see those witnesses. I want to know who signed off on that county record. And I want to know how Cassian Rourke's people got access to this property before my father was in the ground. Voss looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, Miss Hartwell, I'd encourage you to find yourself legal counsel before you say anything else. Is that a threat? It's advice. He remounted and rode out through the gate at the same pace he'd arrived, not hurrying, not lingering, and Elowen stood at her father's grave and watched him go and understood, with a certainty that settled in her bones like the cold, that this was only the beginning. 3 days. That was how long it took. 3 days of Lenora moving through the house in her careful, contained way, giving instructions to the 2 ranch hands who remained, accepting visits from Rourke's lawyers with a composure that Elowen initially read as shock and later began to read as something else entirely. Elowen spent those 3 days in her father's office, going through every paper he owned. She found the real accounts. She found the records of what the ranch actually owed, which was ordinary a modest credit line at the Dunmore Mercantile, a small note on the east pasture fence repair, the normal accumulation of a working ranch that was not in trouble and had never been in trouble. Gideon Hartwell had been a careful man. He'd spent 30 years building something that couldn't be easily taken, which told Elowen something important. If someone had gone to the trouble of forging a $7,000 dollet, they weren't doing it because they needed the money. They were doing it because they needed the land. On the morning of the 3rd day, Lenora called her into the parlor. The parlor had 2 of Rourke's lawyers in it, men in dark coats with leather cases on their knees and the satisfied expressions of people who know the outcome before the meeting starts. Territorial provision is clear, the older one said. He had white sideburns and spectacles, and the manner of a man who had explained difficult things to many difficult people and found it tedious but profitable. In cases where an estate cannot satisfy a recorded debt and no male heir exists, the law permits the creditor to claim labor indentured from female members of the estate, not to exceed 7 years, as settlement. Elowen sat very still. 7 years, she said. Standard practice in cases of... There is no debt. She said it flatly, like stating a weather condition. The note is forged. My father did not borrow that money. County record was corrupted, along with the marshal and whatever witnesses signed that document. She looked at Lenora. You know this. You've read the actual accounts. Tell them. Lenora's hands were folded in her lap. She looked, Elowen would think about it later, like a woman who has already accepted a painful outcome and is waiting for everyone else to catch up. Elowen, she said. Please listen to what they're saying. Something went cold in Elowen's chest. Excuse me? The legal situation is what it is. There are options being offered that are. You're agreeing with them. It wasn't a question. You're sitting in my father's parlor, in my father's house, agreeing with the men who forged his signature. I'm trying to help you survive this, by selling me into indenture. The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. The lawyer with the sideburns cleared his throat. The arrangement would be supervised and regulated. Miss Hartwell's well-being, get out of this house. Elowen stood. Both of you, get out of my father's house right now. They didn't get out. They left at their own pace, collecting their cases and adjusting their coats, and the older one said something to Lenora on the way to the door that Elowen didn't hear and didn't want to. 3 hours later, a paper arrived from the county seat. The auction was set for Saturday. She told herself she would not cry. She told herself this on Friday night, lying in the room she'd slept in her entire life, staring at the ceiling while the wind worked itself against the window panes. She told herself she'd survived 25 years of people looking at her body and drawing conclusions from what they saw. She'd survived her father's ranch hands, who initially wouldn't take orders from her until she'd proved she could outwork them. She'd survived the women in town who referred to her as poor Gideon's daughter, in voices that managed to be simultaneously sympathetic and contemptuous. She could survive Saturday. What she had not accounted for was the crowd. Red Hollow's central square filled on Saturday morning with the ordinary population of a frontier town that didn't have enough entertainment and found suffering more interesting than it should have. Some came out of genuine curiosity, but some came because they might legitimately be in the market for labor. Most came for the same reason people always gathered at spectacles, because it cost nothing and might be memorable. The platform was wood, unpainted, raised about 2 feet off the ground. Elowen climbed it with her hands free and her back straight and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, on a point somewhere above the crowd's heads, because looking at faces was a mistake she understood even before she made it. She was wearing her good dress. She had done her hair carefully. She'd spent an hour that morning deciding whether to do her hair carefully, whether it constituted some kind of surrender to perform dignity in an undignified situation, and had eventually concluded that her dignity belonged to her regardless of who was watching or why. The auctioneer, a wiry little man named Peterson, who ran the county's foreclosure sales and seemed to find the expansion of his duties unremarkable, began the proceedings with the legal language, the debt, the provisions, the terms. Then he opened the floor. The silence lasted only a moment before it filled with something worse than silence. What's the weight on her? A man from somewhere in the back. The voice was jovial, performatively jovial, the voice of a man who has located an audience and decided to perform for it. Laughter. Not from everyone, but enough. She'll eat more than she earns, someone else called out. Different voice, same tone. I got a mule does twice the work for half the oats. More laughter. Peterson called for order in a way that suggested he wasn't deeply committed to achieving it. Elowen kept her eyes on the middle distance. Her hands were clasped in front of her. She was concentrating, very specifically, on her breathing, on keeping it even, on not letting the trembling that had started somewhere behind her sternum work its way to the surface. Don't let them see it. Don't let them see it. Don't let them mine it. I wouldn't take her for free. A third voice, this one closer to the platform. Somebody'd have to pay me. The laughter this time was bigger. And something in Elowen, something that had been holding a shape for 25 years through sheer force of will, finally gave. She looked at them. She looked at the faces of men she had known her whole life, men her father had traded with, men her father had helped during dry seasons and hard winters, men who had sat at Gideon Hartwell's table and eaten his food and taken his handshake and now stood in this square and laughed at his daughter on an auction platform and called it entertainment. Don't sell me away. Her voice came out low, too quiet for the whole crowd to hear. She wasn't performing. She was talking to the space in front of her, to the cold morning air. Don't sell me away. My father worked 30 years for that land. He didn't borrow that money. The note is forged. Somebody in this square knows that and isn't saying it, and I am asking. Her voice broke. She stopped it there, pulled it back, but too late. I am asking if there is anyone here willing to do the right thing. Square was quiet. Not the respectful quiet of people considering. The uncomfortable quiet of people who know what they should do and have collectively decided not to do it. Peterson started the bidding at $500. No one moved. He dropped to $300. Still nothing. He was opening his mouth to try $200 when the sound came from the edge of the square. Not from inside the crowd, but from outside it, from the street that fed into the square's eastern end. Hoof beats. One horse, not hurrying, which somehow made it louder than a gallop would have been. Kind of pace that has nowhere urgent to be because everywhere it goes becomes the place that matters. Crowd turned. The horse was black, not the common dirty black of most working animals, but the particular deep black of something that had been bred and maintained with serious intention. It was enormous, and it moved with the controlled precision of an animal that had learned not to be bothered by crowds, because its rider never gave it reason to be. The rider was not small. He was a large man, wide through the shoulders, built in the way that suggested the width was functional rather than decorative. He wore a coat that had seen considerable weather. He had a scar that ran from the left side of his jaw toward his ear, old enough to have faded to a pale seam, but positioned in a way that caught the light. He was not wearing his hat pulled down to avoid eye contact. He was looking at the platform. He was looking at Elowen. He walked the horse to the edge of the gathered crowd and stopped, and the crowd made space in the particular way. Crowds make space for people they are not certain they want to argue with. Peterson, with the professional instinct of a man who understands that momentum matters, called out, "Any opening bids on a 7-year indenture, skilled in household and ranch work?" 3,000, the rider said. His voice was not loud. He didn't need it to be. The square was already quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. The crowd had shifted from uncomfortable to attentive, and in that kind of silence, a normal speaking voice carries. $3,000, Peterson said, and even he seemed momentarily recalibrated. Is there any? The man who'd made the joke about the mule opened his mouth and then closed it. The man who'd said he wouldn't take her for free was looking at the ground. The rider's eyes had moved from Peterson back to Elowen, and he was still looking at her with the same expression. Not pity. She understood that immediately. Not pity. Not interest of the sort that made her skin crawl. Not the evaluating look of someone assessing a purchase. Something else. Something she didn't have a category for yet. Gold, he added, as if this needed clarifying. Nobody else bid. Peterson gavelled the auction closed with the particular efficiency of a man who senses the temperature of a crowd and makes decisions accordingly. The rider dismounted. He was even larger standing on the ground than he had seemed on horseback, and the crowd gave him the same instinctive space it had given his horse. He walked toward the platform steps, not to the side, not waiting for Elowen to come to him, and stopped at the base of the steps and looked up at her. Up close, she could see that his eyes were dark brown, and that the expression she hadn't been able to categorize from a distance was something like assessment, not of her body, not of her face, but of something harder to define. The way a person looks at a situation they're trying to calculate. Bram Calder, he said. She'd heard the name. Everybody in 3 counties had heard the name. Bram Calder, who'd come out of the war with a reputation that most men kept deliberately vague when they described it. Bram Calder, who ran a mountain ranch alone and didn't invite company, and whose reputation was substantial enough that even the rougher elements of the territory gave his property a wide berth. "I know who you are," she said. "Then you know I don't generally ride into town for entertainment." He said this not unkindly. More like a man establishing facts before proceeding to the relevant point. "I need to talk to you." "Not here." He glanced at the crowd, which was watching them with the concentrated attention of an audience that hasn't decided yet whether the show is over. "When you're ready." "I'm ready now." She came down the platform steps herself. She didn't wait for him to offer a hand, and he didn't offer one, which she noted. "My horse is at the rail." He turned back toward where he'd come from. "You can ride pillion, or I can arrange—" "I'm not riding pillion on someone else's horse." She said it without heat, just a statement of fact. "I'll get my mare from the livery. She's been boarded here since yesterday." Stopped, turned back to look at her. She met his eyes and waited. Something moved through his expression that might, in different light, have been the beginning of a different kind of respect. "All right," he said. She went to the livery and got her horse herself, and she rode out of Red Hollow beside Bram Calder in the mid-morning light with the crowd watching them go. And she did not look back at the auction platform, and she did not look at Lenora, who was standing at the edge of the square, with her hands folded and her face arranged into something Elowen couldn't interpret. There would be time to interpret it later. Right now she had a horse under her and a road in front of her, and a man riding beside her who had spent $3,000 for a reason she didn't yet understand, and that was enough to work with. They rode for 2 hours before he spoke. The trail out of Red Hollow climbed steadily, and the scrub brush of the valley gave way to stands of pine as the elevation gained. And the cold that had been present all morning became serious, the kind of cold that enters through the gaps in your clothing and settles in your joints and reminds you that this landscape does not make accommodations. Elowen had dressed practically. She had not known exactly where she was going yesterday when she'd packed her saddlebag, but she had packed for mountain country, because some instinct had told her the only options available to her were going to involve either confrontation or movement, and movement in this territory meant elevation. She was grateful for that instinct now. The trail narrowed as it climbed, and they rode single file with Calder ahead. She watched him ride. He sat the way very experienced riders sit, not with the exaggerated ease of someone performing comfort, but with the genuine economy of a person who has spent so many hours in the saddle that the horse's motion has become incorporated into his own. He didn't check behind him frequently. When he did, it was a quick, functional scan, the look of someone who learned that habit for reasons. "Why did you do it?" she finally asked. He didn't answer immediately. She'd noticed that about him. He processed before he responded, which was either a careful habit or a natural one. She wasn't sure yet. "Your father came to see me," he said, without turning. 6 weeks ago. She hadn't expected that. Why? He said he was worried about what might happen to him, and that if something did happen, there was something he needed someone to protect. A pause. He'd been keeping records on Rourke, on how Rourke operates. The pine branches moved overhead in a wind she could hear but barely feel at ground level. "He never told me," she said. "He said he didn't want you involved until he was sure he had enough. He didn't want you in the line of what he was accumulating." And instead he rode off a cliff. Calder's horse adjusted its footing on a loose section of trail, and he shifted his weight automatically to compensate. And then he said, it wasn't an accident. She had known this. She had known it from the moment they'd told her where they'd found him Gideon Hartwell, who had ridden that trail 100 times in 30 years and knew every loose stone and blind curve on it. She had known it, and she had pressed it down somewhere and dealt with the immediate crisis, because falling apart was a luxury for later. Later was apparently now. She breathed once, twice. Cold air helped. It had a specificity to it, a physical demand for presence that kept her from leaving her body entirely. "What did he bring you?" she asked, a ledger, his own records of what he'd documented. "But he said it needed you to make sense of it. He said you knew his system, the way he coded entries, the private marks he used." A pause. "He said you were the only one who could actually prove it was genuine." Elowen thought about her father sitting at his desk with his lamp lit, working through numbers in his careful leftward hand. She thought about how he'd taught her the accounts, not because she'd insisted, though she had, but because he'd believed, in a way that had sometimes made her chest ache with gratitude that she needed every tool available to her. She thought about him climbing a mountain alone at night to deposit a ledger with the most frightening man in 3 counties, because he'd run out of people he trusted and time he could afford. "He trusted you," she said. "He trusted that I was the one person Rourke couldn't buy or threaten." Calder's voice was flat. Not humble, not proud. Factual. Whether that trust was well placed, I guess you'll find out. "And the auction today? Your father left instructions. If anything happened to him, the ledger goes to you." But he also said another pause, longer this time. He said you might need some way out of whatever situation you found yourself in first. The trail broke out onto a short flat section, and for a moment Elowen could see across the valley, the distant smear of Red Hollow, the frozen thread of the creek that ran through the lower meadows, the broad sweep of country that she'd grown up looking at from her father's porch and had somehow assumed would always be there. "He planned for this," she said. "He planned for worse than this." He planned for the possibility that he wouldn't survive long enough to see it through. Calder glanced back at her one of those brief, functional scans. Thorough man. Yes, she said, he was. They rode on. The ranch came into view an hour before they reached it, which was a function of the terrain. Mountain country revealed things at distance, and then hid them as you descended into draws and climbed out of them, so you caught glimpses long before arrival. It was a working operation, not large but solid. A main house built from logs that had weathered to a particular shade of gray, a barn that was structurally serious, a series of outbuildings. No decorative elements, no concessions to appearance that weren't also functional. She was cataloging it professionally, the way she'd cataloged her father's operation, noting condition and capacity, before she caught herself and recognized what she was doing. Her mind defaulted to assessment as a defense mechanism. She'd done it her whole life, reduced the unknown to inventory, to numbers that could be managed. Calder dismounted at the barn and took both horses without making a production of it. Elowen watched him work, the unself-conscious efficiency of someone who has done this thousands of times without an audience. Inside the barn, while he was settling the horses, she said, "What exactly do you expect of me, while I'm here?" He didn't look up from checking her mare's feet. The mare, who generally had opinions about strangers handling her hooves, stood still with the philosophical acceptance of an animal that has assessed the situation and found resistance impractical. "Nothing particular," he said. "That's not an answer." He straightened, looked at her directly, which she'd noticed he did when he was about to say something he wanted to be unambiguous about. "I paid the debt," he said. "I didn't buy you. Those are different things." He went back to the horse. "Your room is the one at the end of the hall. There's water in the pitcher and wood by the stove. If you're hungry, there's food in the kitchen, and if you want to cook it yourself or have me cook it or not eat until next Tuesday, that's your business." He paused. "The ledger is in the desk in the main room. I thought you'd want to look at it tonight." She stood with this for a moment. "You live alone up here," she said. "Yes. You've been living alone up here for 7 years," he said. Not inviting the next question. She didn't ask it. There would be time for the next question later, and she had enough to work with right now. A warm room and her father's ledger waiting on a desk. "I'll look at the accounts tonight," she said. "And tomorrow we need to talk about how to get the evidence to someone with actual authority to act on it. Which, given that Voss is in Rourke's pocket, means the territorial court." He nodded slowly. "That's a 2-week ride under good conditions." "I know. The conditions are currently not good." He studied her for a moment with the expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that was calculating without being unfriendly. "You've thought about this." "I've thought about nothing else for 3 days." She moved toward the barn door. "And I've spent 4 years keeping a ranch's accounts, and 2 years before that watching my father keep them. I know what forged numbers look like. I know what real ones look like. And I know what it means when a man with Rourke's kind of money needs to forge a $7,000 debt against a ranch worth considerably more than $7,000. She paused in the doorway. "He doesn't want the money. He wants the land." Calder was quiet. "My father figured that out too," he finally said. "Took him most of a year. It took me 48 hours. She stepped out into the cold. "I'll be in the kitchen if you need me." She heard something behind her as she crossed the yard, and it took her a moment to identify it. Quiet, and she almost missed it under the wind. She was fairly certain, the sound of Bram Calder almost laughing. The ledger was exactly what her father had described in his own way 100 times over the years, without ever describing it at all. She'd heard him talk about Rourke, not with the specific language of accusation, but in the way a careful man talks about something he's watching closely. "Cassian Rourke's bank is getting very large very fast," he'd said once, 2 summers ago, over coffee in the early morning when he thought she was only half listening. "And the ranches that go under tend to stay under in ways that don't look quite right." She'd pressed him on it. He'd gotten vague. Now she understood why. She sat at the desk in the main room, a substantial piece of furniture, built to work at, not to display, with the lamp turned up and her father's ledger open in front of her. Calder had built the fire up before he retreated to wherever he retreated to in the evenings, and the room was warm in the way mountain rooms are warm, aggressively, gratefully warm, in direct proportion to how brutal the outside had been. Gideon Hartwell had been keeping records for 11 months. Coded them, not elaborately, not with any cipher designed to be impenetrable, but with the private shorthand he'd developed over 30 years of bookkeeping. Elowen had learned it so gradually, sitting at his elbow through her childhood and adolescence, that she'd absorbed it without ever consciously studying it. It was just how her father's numbers looked, the way certain entries had a small mark in the margin, the way he folded certain amounts into parentheses, the way a particular notation in the corner of a page meant look at this date. She began to work through it. An hour in, she was certain the debt was forged. Not just suspected certain, in the way a mathematician is certain, with the numbers lying out in front of her in sequence, telling a story they couldn't contradict. 2 hours in, she found something her father hadn't explained in the ledger. Something she had to read twice before she understood what she was seeing. The names, not just the Hartwell ranch, not just the forged debt against her father's land. 6 other ranches in 3 counties. Same pattern, a death or a crisis, a debt that appeared from nowhere, an auction, a purchase. The lands absorbed into Rourke's holdings under different names, different corporate instruments, different layers of legal distance. But underneath it, in the account numbers, in the dates, in the particular sequence of how the transactions flowed, it was the same hand. Her father had traced it. 7 families, at minimum. Probably more. She sat back from the desk and looked at the fire for a long moment. Then she thought, Rourke has an army of lawyers and a marshal in his pocket and a territorial court that he may or may not own outright. I have a ledger, a man with a frightening reputation, and a 2-week ride through mountains in winter. She looked back at the ledger. She thought about her father climbing this mountain alone and carrying these records to the one person he believed would protect them. She thought about the way she'd looked at the auction platform, and the crowd had looked back at her, waiting for her to break. She picked up her father's pen. She'd packed it automatically, without thinking, just took it from the desk, where he'd left it, because she couldn't leave it behind, and she opened the back cover of the ledger, where there were blank pages. She began to make her own notes. If they were going to the territorial court, she was going to be ready. Not almost ready, not mostly ready. She was going to walk in there with numbers so clean and so complete and so thoroughly documented that not one lawyer Cassian Rourke had ever met could find a seam in them. Outside, the wind worked at the windows, and somewhere in the mountain above the ranch, an owl made its sound once and then went quiet. Elowen Hartwell kept writing. She fell asleep at the desk sometime after midnight with her cheek on her own notes and her father's pen still loosely held between her fingers. She didn't mean to. She'd been working through the 3rd cluster of transactions, the Aldridge Ranch, absorbed into Rourke's holdings under a shell company called Meridian Grazing 14 months ago, and somewhere between one entry and the next. Her body made a decision her mind hadn't authorized. She woke to gray light and the sound of something on the stove. For one disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was, and her first thought was her father's name, not called out, just present. The way his name had been present every morning for the last 4 years because she'd gotten up early to have coffee ready before he came downstairs. Then the room reassembled itself around her. The log walls, the substantial desk, the fire that had burned low and was now just orange coals, the ledger open in front of her, with her own handwriting filling the back pages. Calder was in the kitchen. She could hear the specific sounds, the particular knock of an iron pot, the hiss of water, the scratch of a match that didn't catch on the first strike and had to be tried again. Ordinary morning sounds. She sat up and pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes and told herself to organize her thinking before she walked into that kitchen, because the last thing she needed was to be seen stumbling into the day. She straightened the ledger. She stacked her notes. She ran her fingers through her hair, which had come partially loose from its pins overnight, and got it back into something functional, if not presentable. Then she stood, and her back reminded her in specific terms that she'd spent the night bent over a desk in a chair that was built for a larger person's posture, and she absorbed that information and moved into the kitchen anyway. Calder was at the stove. He had a pot of oats going and coffee already made, and he'd put a tin mug on the table without comment. He didn't look up when she came in, or if he did, she missed it, because she went straight to the coffee and wrapped both hands around the mug and let the heat work into her palms. "You slept at the desk," he said. "It wasn't a question. I fell asleep at the desk. There's a difference." He made a sound that might have been agreement. She sat down at the table and drank the coffee, which was strong enough to be taken seriously, and looked out the window at the mountain morning, the pale sky, the dark trees, the particular quality of winter light that was bright without being warm. "I read through all of it," she said. He turned from the stove. This time he did look at her directly, and, "It's not just us," she set the mug down. "My father documented 6 other ranches. Same method every time a debt that appears after some kind of crisis, a death or a fire or a failed season, and then a purchase at auction that looks legitimate until you follow the paper trail backward and find where Rourke's money is actually sitting." She paused. "He's been doing this for at least 5 years, probably longer. My father's records only go back that far because that's when he started watching." Calder moved the pot off the direct heat. He was quiet for a moment in the way she'd come to recognize, not avoiding the conversation, just processing it. 7 families, he said, at minimum. There could be others my father didn't find. She looked at the mug. "He spent almost a year building this, alone, without telling me." The last sentence came out with a particular quality she hadn't intended. Not accusation, not grief exactly, more like the specific ache of understanding a decision someone made to protect you that you would have made differently. "He was protecting you," Calder said, simply. "I know. I understand why." She picked up the mug again. "I also think he was wrong. I think I could have helped him build it faster and better, and he might still be—" She stopped. "Anyway, that's done." She took a breath. "What I need to know is whether the territorial court is actually independent of Rourke, or whether we'd be walking into another room he's already bought." Calder pulled the bench out from the table and sat down across from her. His weight shifted the bench, and he settled onto it with the unself-conscious solidity of a man who has long since stopped being aware of the space his body takes up. Judge at the territorial seat is a man named Colbert Haynes. He's been there 12 years. Rourke's tried to work around him at least twice that I know of, redirecting cases to county level where he has better control. He picked up his own coffee. "Haynes isn't owned. Whether he's brave enough to act on what your father put together is a different question." "What do you mean?" "I mean, there's a difference between an honest man and a courageous one." He said it without bitterness. Just the same flat factual delivery she was getting used to. "Haynes is honest. He follows the law. But Rourke has money and connections that go past the territory, and an honest man can look at a situation and decide the risk isn't worth the outcome. So we'd need to make it worth his while. We'd need to make the case so complete he can't find a reason not to act." He looked at her. "Can your father's records do that?" "My father's records are a foundation." She turned the mug in her hands. "I spent 4 hours last night reorganizing the entries into a sequence any court could follow. But there are gaps, places where my father tracked the pattern but didn't have the underlying documents to prove it. We'd need those." "What kind of documents?" "The original loan instruments from the ranches Rourke absorbed. The actual property transfers. The probate records where the debt claims were filed." She'd worked through this in the early hours of the morning, the part before she'd fallen asleep. "Those would all be at the county seat. Filed in public records, theoretically accessible to anyone." Calder was quiet. "The county clerk works for Voss," he said. "I know. Voss works for Rourke. I know that too." She met his eyes. "I didn't say it would be simple. I said it's what we need." Something moved through his expression that wasn't quite amusement. "A brother to it, maybe. You've been awake most of the night processing the worst situation of your life, and your primary response is to make a list of what you need to fix it. Considered this. Is that strange?" "Not strange." He drank his coffee. "Just not what most people do. Most people didn't spend 4 years being responsible for a ranch's books." She looked at the window. "When something goes wrong in accounts, you don't fix it by grieving the error. You find where the numbers diverged from reality, and you correct them, and you build systems to prevent the same error from recurring." She paused. "People aren't so different from numbers when you look at them the right way." He said nothing for a moment. "Then, your father said you were the only one who could make this work." "He said that to you?" "When he came up here with the ledger." He sat at this table. Calder looked at the surface between them. He said, Elowen will understand what to do with this. She's the one who should have been managing the ranch from the beginning, but I was too proud to admit it. Don't let anyone tell her what she can and can't do with this evidence. Kitchen was very quiet. Elowen looked at her hands around the mug. Her father's pen was still in her coat pocket, where she'd moved it when she'd stood up. "I'd feel it there." "He said that," she said. It wasn't really a question. Exactly that. She nodded once and didn't trust herself to say anything else for a moment. Calder stood and went back to the stove and gave the oats attention they didn't particularly need. And she understood that this was a courtesy giving her a moment that didn't require an audience. She hadn't expected that from him. She filed it away. They spent the morning working. Not the polite, exploratory kind of working, where two people circle around each other establishing terms. The functional kind, where a problem is present and both people have capacity, and the fastest path is to simply begin. Elowen laid the ledger's full contents out on the kitchen table in the sequence she'd established the night before. The pattern of acquisition, the financial instruments involved, the timeline of Rourke's operations across 3 counties. Calder listened with the attentiveness of someone who has learned that most problems can be solved by understanding them thoroughly before attempting to move. He contributed things she hadn't known. He'd been watching Rourke's operation from the edges for 2 years, not systematically, not with the methodical record-keeping her father had employed, but with the observational attention of a man who lives alone in the mountains and notices what moves through the territory below him. He knew which roads Rourke's men used. He knew the schedule of Maddox Kane, Rourke's head enforcer, a man with a reputation for the kind of efficiency that made witnesses reconsider what they'd seen. He knew that Voss had a deputy stationed at the county records office, specifically on the days that any inquiries about land transfers came in. "Then we can't approach the records directly," Elowen said. "Not from the front." He had a map spread beside the ledger now, a hand-drawn thing with elevations marked in pencil and trails indicated by dotted lines. "There are 2 other copies of county records required by territorial law. One at the county seat, one at the district land office in Harrow's Crossing, and one archived at the territorial capital. You know territorial property law. I know the laws that apply to things I own. Not defensive, just accurate." She looked at the map. Harrow's Crossing was marked at the eastern edge 2 days' ride in current conditions, assuming the Sallow Creek Pass wasn't closed by weather. If we go to Harrow's Crossing, would Rourke's people be there? Some, probably. He has connections everywhere. But the land office clerk in Harrow's Crossing is not one of Voss's people. He pointed to a notation on the map. A man named Piercy. He and Voss had a falling out 3 years ago over a boundary dispute that went in Piercy's favor. He is not inclined to do Voss favors. You know a remarkable amount about the interpersonal conflicts of territorial officials. When you live alone, you pay attention to what other people don't think to. She studied the map. The route to Harrow's Crossing would take them through high country in winter conditions, exposed on the ridgeline sections, with limited shelter if weather moved in fast. She'd ridden worse. She'd ridden worse last April, when she'd gone out alone to find 3 strayed cattle in a late-season snowstorm and located them in a draw 6 miles from the main pasture and brought them back herself because both ranch hands were sick and the work wasn't going to do itself. "When can we leave?" she asked. Calder looked at her. She'd noticed that he did this, looked at people for a full moment before answering, as if checking that the question he'd heard was the one actually being asked. "I need a day to provision and check the horses. Cold weather travel, you don't rush the preparation. Tomorrow morning, early. I'm always up early." She began reordering the ledger pages. "I'll need paper and ink. I want to make a complete copy of my father's records before we take the originals anywhere. Desk drawer, there's paper and 2 good pens." He paused. "The originals stay here until we're ready." She looked up. "Why? Because the mountain is easier to defend than a saddlebag." His expression was level. "If someone comes up here looking for the ledger before we leave, I want it here where I know the ground and I know the exits. I've been keeping it safe for 6 weeks. I can keep it safe for 1 more day." She considered this. It was sound reasoning. It was also, she recognized, the reasoning of someone who had thought through the possibility of armed confrontation with the particular concreteness of experience. All right, she said, one more day. She spent that day copying records. It was in the late afternoon, while Calder was in the barn attending to the horses and equipment, that Elowen found the second ledger. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd been at the desk copying, her hand aching from the sustained writing, and she'd opened the bottom drawer for the extra ink Calder had mentioned and found. Beneath a stack of blank paper and some old receipts, a thin journal with a worn leather cover. She almost closed the drawer. It wasn't hers. She had no reason to look at it. But some conjunction of the light angle and the particular worn look of the binding made her take it out and open the first page. Calder's handwriting. She hadn't seen it before, but she was good at handwriting as a skill had learned to read her father's and the various scripted hands of lawyers and clerks and county officials. And this was distinctive. Larger than her father's, more deliberate, the kind of writing a person produces when they're concentrating on the formation of letters because they're not entirely sure of them. She read the first entry. It was dated 4 years ago. It was about a man named Joseph, who appeared to have been Calder's younger brother, and what had happened to him, and why Bram Calder had left the lower country and come up here to the mountain. Closed the journal. She sat very still with it in her hands for a moment, not reading, just sitting. Then she put it exactly as she'd found it, in the exact position under the blank paper, and closed the drawer and went back to her copying. She didn't tell him she'd found it, and she didn't look at it again. But she thought about it, quietly, as the afternoon light changed and the mountain cold pressed against the windows, and she understood something about the man in the barn that she hadn't understood before. Why he lived up here alone. Why the reputation he had frightened people, and why her father, who had been an extraordinary judge of character, had trusted him with the most important thing he'd left behind. They left before sunrise. The sky was still the deep dark blue of pre-dawn when Elowen came out of the house with her saddlebag and found Calder already mounted, both horses ready. His pack horse loaded and cinched with the compressed efficiency of someone who has packed for hard travel many times. The temperature was the kind of cold that had physical weight to it, that pressed on your chest when you breathed and made your fingers slow and deliberate. You eat? He asked. There's dried beef in my bag. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. His expression was the level one, the factual one, with something underneath it that she was learning to read as the specific patience of a person who has decided to care about an outcome and is trying not to make that obvious. I ate, she said. Good. He handed her a second item, a wrapped something that turned out when she held it to be warm. Cornbread, wrapped in cloth, still holding the heat of the oven. For the first hour, mountain cold burns through what you have fast. She put it in her coat pocket without comment. It sat against her ribs with a warmth that spread slowly through her side as they rode. The trail down from Calder's mountain was different in the dark familiar shapes turned unfamiliar, the terrain requiring more attention and more trust in the horses, who were better at this than their riders in darkness. The black stallion moved with the same unhurried certainty it had displayed in the town square. Her mare picked her way with a focused attention that Elowen appreciated. They didn't talk much for the first 2 hours. The mountain didn't encourage it, the footing demanded concentration, and concentration demanded quiet. There was something in the shared silence that was not uncomfortable. Different from the silences she'd experienced in the days since her father died, which had been full of other people's awkward condolences or their calculated absences. This silence was just two people moving through difficult terrain together. When the light came up enough to see clearly, and the trail widened into a traveled path, Calder pulled alongside her. Tell me about Rourke, he said. What your father's records show about how he started. She had thought about this the night before, organizing it narratively as well as numerically, because a court needed a story as much as it needed figures. And she was beginning to understand that she was going to have to tell this story to people who would not automatically want to believe it. He started with credit, she said. A small cattle bank in Dunmore, legitimate operation at first. Made reasonable loans to ranchers at reasonable rates. Built a reputation as someone who was good to work with. She kept her eyes on the trail ahead, pulling the information from the organized structure she'd built last night. The first suspicious transaction appears 4 years back. A rancher named Holloway, his wife, died in a fever summer. He took out a loan to cover the loss of income during her illness. And the following spring, there was an entry in the county ledger showing a second loan against the property that Holloway says he never signed. Like your father, like my father, but Holloway didn't have the documentation my father had. And by the time Holloway tried to contest it, the judge at the county level appointed 18 months earlier found against him. She paused. That judge resigned 6 months after the Holloway decision. He's now employed as a legal consultant for Meridian Grazing, which is Rourke's holding company. Calder made a sound that wasn't a word but conveyed understanding of the specific kind. After Holloway, Rourke moved faster, she continued. The pattern sharpened. Each operation was cleaner than the last, fewer loose ends, better document preparation. He was learning. She glanced at Calder. Whoever is forging the signatures has gotten considerably better over 4 years. The note against my father's estate would have fooled anyone who didn't know his handwriting as well as I do. What did you see that was wrong? His capital G. My father's G has a particular curve in the upper loop because of the way he held his pen, the broken fingers I mentioned. Whoever forged it wrote a standard textbook G, the way a person writes when they're being careful to be legible. My father's handwriting wasn't trying to be legible, trying to be fast. She thought of how many times she'd watched that hand move across paper. You can't fake the shortcuts of a person who's been writing the same way for 40 years. Calder nodded slowly. You can testify to that. I can testify to it with documentation. I made comparisons last night, a full page of them, my father's actual handwriting from dated letters and account entries alongside the forged signature, annotated to show specific differences. She'd finished that section around 2 in the morning, before the sleep had overtaken her. Any court that looks at that comparison can see it. The question is whether they'll let themselves see it. That's why the other documents matter. The pattern across multiple ranches. Yes, one forged signature is something a lawyer can argue. 6 instances of the same technique applied to 6 different families over 4 years is a system. It's organizational. It can't be explained as individual errors or coincidences. She looked at the road ahead. My father understood that. He spent a year documenting it because he knew a single accusation against Cassian Rourke wouldn't survive. The accumulation is what makes it impossible to dismiss. Calder was quiet for a stretch. The trail dipped through a narrow draw where the cold collected in layers, frost thick on the shadowed sides of the rocks. The horses picked through it steadily. How far into Rourke's operation do you think this goes? He asked. Politicians, territorial officials? I don't know yet. She admitted it directly. My father suspected Voss was the central corrupt official, with 1 or 2 county judges below him. But whether it goes higher, whether there are territorial appointees who are also receiving money from Rourke, I can't say from what I have. She paused. Which is why we need Harrow's Crossing before we go to the territorial seat. The land office records there will either confirm or deny whether the territorial capital has been compromised. Smart order. It's the only order that makes sense if you're trying not to show your hand before you know the table. She said it without thinking, a phrase her father had used when teaching her to play cards with the ranch hands on slow winter evenings, before she'd gotten good enough that they stopped wanting to play with her. The memory came at her sideways, the way they did, and she breathed through it. Your father taught you cards, Calder said. Not a question. She looked at him. How did you know the expression? Same one I get when a phrase comes out of a memory that wasn't where I meant to go. He looked ahead. He talked about you for 3 hours when he came up the mountain. Sitting at that kitchen table with his ledger and his coffee going cold while he talked about you. 3 hours. He was a man who had a lot to say about his daughter, and not many people he could say it to. He said it simply. I learned to make the coffee last. The trail widened ahead into the first of the high meadows, the grass flat and dead under its frost cover, the sky above them now fully light and carrying the particular pale clarity of a high winter day. They were exposed here, but would be through this section in an hour, if the conditions held. Elowen looked at the open country around them, and felt, alongside the cold and the weight of what they were carrying, a sensation she couldn't immediately name. It took her another half-mile to identify it. It was purpose. The specific gravity of having a clear thing to do and the capacity to do it, moving toward it at a pace that was both difficult and sustainable. She'd felt it before, in smaller forms, solving a knotty account problem, organizing the ranch's summer schedule, the moment when a thing that had seemed chaotic resolved into a pattern she could work with. She had not felt it since the morning she'd found her father's account books and understood what the forged debt meant. She was feeling it now. Calder, she said. My father's ledger. Copy I made stays at the ranch, and the original comes with us. The right call? He glanced at her. You already agreed to this yesterday. I'm not questioning it. I'm confirming the logic so I know I haven't missed anything. She'd learned this habit from her father, to checking your assumptions before you committed to a path, not because you were uncertain, but because the check itself was a discipline. Original with us, he said, because we'll need to show it to Piercy at the land office to establish what we're looking for. Copy at the ranch, because if something happens to us, he stopped. If something happens to the original, she noticed the edit. If something happens to us had become, if something happens to the original. She didn't comment on it. I also made a second copy last night, she said. Of the most critical entries, the forged debt documentation, the pattern across the 6 ranches, my comparative handwriting analysis. Turned to look at her. Where is it? Separate from the ledger. In my saddlebag, but wrapped separately and packed at the bottom. She met his eyes. If someone takes the ledger, they don't automatically get everything. He held her gaze for a moment. Your father said you were the right person for this, he said. My father was usually right about things. He was. Something crossed his face, a different quality than his usual expression, more complicated. I'm sorry he's not here to see it. The words landed on her with a precision she hadn't braced for. She looked at the trail ahead and breathed through it the way she had in the barn and at the kitchen untable and on the platform in Red Hollow's square, the discipline of grief that had become its own kind of practice. So am I, she said. They rode on into the open country, the cold working steadily at them, the mountain growing smaller behind them. And Elowen kept her father's ledger in the saddlebag against her left leg, and his pen in her coat pocket against her ribs, and moved forward at a pace she intended to maintain all the way to the territorial court, if that's what it took. They made 12 miles before the trouble found them. Not armed trouble, that would come later, in a different canyon with different terrain. This trouble was weather, which arrived with the sudden decision that high country weather makes, the sky shifting from its pale clarity to the particular gray that people who work outdoors learn to read as a serious statement. Calder saw it before she did. He pulled up on a section of trail where a rock formation gave them a brief windbreak and turned in the saddle to look north, his expression doing something she'd learned to pay attention to. That's moving fast, he said. She looked north. The gray had depth to it, layers, the front edge of something with serious weight behind it. How long, she asked. 4 hours, maybe less. He calculated visibly. There's a line cabin on the eastern face used to belong to an old trapper named Falk. Been empty for 2 seasons, but the structure's still sound. About 6 miles. That's achievable. It'll be a push. Then we push. She adjusted her seat and looked at him. Unless you think we should go back. His eyes moved from the weather to her and back to the weather. No, he said, we go forward. Rourke's people know we're missing. Every day we wait is a day they use to prepare, then 6 miles. Let's move. They moved. The next 2 hours were the first real test of what this partnership was actually going to require. Not the comfortable morning conversation over coffee and maps. The hard reality of covering ground under worsening conditions with a deadline that was visible on the northern horizon and closing. The trail narrowed and steepened, and the horses had opinions about the combination of factors being presented to them, and Elowen managed her mare with the focused attention of a horsewoman who has ridden through bad weather before and knows the specific difference between an animal that is reluctant and an animal that is genuinely afraid. Her mare was reluctant. She kept her moving. Calder pushed the pace without comment when the terrain allowed it, and slowed without comment when it didn't, and she matched him. And they didn't talk because the wind had come up and talking into it was a waste of energy they needed for other things. The cabin came into view through the first real gusts of the incoming front small, low-roofed, the kind of structure built entirely for function, with a small lean-to on the southern side that was, thank everything practical, still standing. They got the horses under the lean-to. They got themselves inside. The cabin had a stove and a stack of old wood that was dry, which was its entire recommendation as a space. But on that particular afternoon, it was the most important space Elowen Hartwell had ever been inside. Calder had the stove going in 12 minutes. He'd done this before. She could tell from the economy of movement, the specific sequence he used without having to think about it. She was already unpacking the provisions she'd brought inside, sorting what they'd eat tonight from what they'd carry tomorrow, because her hands needed something to do, and planning was the closest thing to control available. The storm hit an hour later and was noisy about it, wind that found every gap in the old structure and announced them, snow that came horizontally and made the small window on the west side opaque within 20 minutes. They ate in the warm noise of it, sitting on opposite sides of the stove on the two low stools that constituted the cabin's furniture, and the firelight moved over the walls, and the storm worked at the structure, and Elowen ate her dried beef and thought through what they still needed to do. The handwriting comparison, she said, between one item and the next. I want to add something to it when we stop next. There's a particular entry in the forged data-comma placement between the principal and the interest figures that appears in two of the other forged documents. Same placement, same hand. Calder was looking at the stove. You found that last night? This morning, actually. Before we left. I noticed it in the copies, and I want to document it formally because it's evidence that the same person forged all of them. It makes it organizational rather than individual. She paused. It also means Rourke employed someone specific for this. A forger on his staff, if we can identify that person. That would break the whole operation open, Calder said. He was looking at her now, not just the individual instances. The infrastructure. Yes. She met his eyes. We'd need someone willing to talk. Someone inside who understood that cooperation was their best option. He was quiet for a moment. There might be someone. She waited. One of the witnesses who signed the debt note on your father's estate, he said slowly. A man named Corbett. He's a clerk at Voss's office. He's been there 3 years, and he doesn't like what he's become part of. I know this because Corbett's brother works a ranch 2 miles from mine, and he has talked to his brother, and his brother has talked to me. He shook his head slightly. Not enough to go to authorities, not yet, but enough to be unhappy. Unhappy men talk to the right person at the right moment. Sometimes, if we had him on record, even a partial statement, it would connect the fraudulent debt mechanism to Voss directly, which connects Voss to Rourke. She thought through the chain. We'd still need the land office records to show the full pattern. But Corbett's testimony plus the documentary evidence could be enough for a court to open a real investigation. Getting to Corbett means going through Voss's territory. Harrow's Crossing first, she said. Documents first. Then Corbett, if he's willing. Then the territorial court with everything we have. Calder looked at the stove again. The fire popped. Outside, the storm made its large and indifferent sounds. You know, he said, most people. In your situation, having just buried their father and stood on an auction platform in front of the whole town and ridden into the mountains with a man they've known for 2 days, most people would spend some of this time being frightened. Elowen considered this. I am frightened, she said. I've been frightened since the moment Voss rode into that yard. She looked at the fire. I just don't have the option of letting the fear make my decisions. My father spent 30 years building something, and someone killed him to take it, and there are 6 other families who lost things the same way and probably didn't have anyone keeping records careful enough to prove it. She paused. The fear can come later. Right now there's work. Calder said nothing for a moment. Then, your father said, when he was sitting at my table with that ledger, he said he was sorry he hadn't told you sooner about what he was finding. He said it was the stupidest thing he'd done in 30 years of mostly smart decisions. She looked at the fire for a long time without speaking. He was stubborn, she finally said. Stubborn and proud, and he thought protecting me meant not asking me to carry hard things. She paused. But he also left me the evidence. He also made sure I'd be the one to use it. She felt the pen in her coat pocket. He just couldn't quite decide whether I needed protecting or whether I was the one doing the protecting. He went back and forth his whole life. Most parents do, Calder said. Quietly, like a man who knew something about that from a different direction. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire. The scar along his jaw was visible in the firelight, that old pale seam that had some story behind it she didn't yet know. She thought about the journal in the desk drawer. She thought about the name Joseph in the careful, deliberate handwriting. She didn't ask. There would be time, maybe, if they got through this, and if not, then the questions would keep until some other accounting. Outside, the storm said everything it had to say, loud and sustained and completely indifferent to the two people inside who had a long road ahead of them and were, for this one night, stopped. The storm blew itself out sometime before dawn. Elowen knew it was over before she opened her eyes. The quality of the silence changed, shifted from the taut, pressurized quiet of weather happening to the flat, settled quiet of weather that has finished its business and moved on. She lay on the cabin's single bunk, taken, because Calder had gestured toward it without discussion, and settled himself on the floor beside the stove, with his coat for a blanket, and the particular ease of a man who has slept on worse surfaces and made his peace with it. She'd argued with him about the floor for approximately 40 seconds before recognizing that the argument was mostly reflex, the instinct to decline comfort when someone offered it, to demonstrate that she didn't require accommodating. She'd let it go and taken the bunk, and she'd slept hard and without dreams for 5 hours, which was more than she'd slept in any single stretch since the night before her father died. She sat up carefully, trying not to wake him. He was already awake. Sitting against the wall by the dead stove with his eyes open, looking at the ceiling with the alert stillness of someone who has been awake for a while and has already completed whatever private thinking the early morning required. "How long has the storm been done?" she asked. "Hour, maybe." He stood with the unhurried efficiency that seemed to characterize everything he did, physically no unnecessary movement, no performance of effort. "I'll get the horses. There's a stream 40 yards east, unfrozen likely, for water." She was already folding the blanket. "I'll start the stove if there's wood left. Enough for coffee." They moved through the morning preparation with the functional efficiency of people who have spent a night sharing a small space and have arrived at an unspoken understanding of how to occupy it without collision. It was not comfortable. Exactly. There was too much uncertainty ahead for comfortable, but it was workable, which was its own kind of reassurance. Outside, the storm had left the landscape transformed in the way only heavy snowfall transforms things, edges gone, distance recalibrated, familiar shapes made strange by new weight. The lean-to had held. The horses were cold and unhappy about it, her mare expressing this opinion in the way she always expressed displeasure, with a specific weighted sigh that Elowen had been interpreting correctly since the animal was 3 years old. "I know," she told the mare, checking her feet. "I'm not pleased either. Let's get moving, and we'll both feel better." The mare's ear flicked, which was not agreement, but was at least acknowledgement. They were back on the trail within the hour, the snow deep enough in places to slow them, but not deep enough to stop them. And the sky above had gone to the sharp pale blue that comes after a serious storm, clear and cold, and offering, at least, the advantage of visibility. Calder rode slightly ahead where the trail was single file, and she watched him navigate with the same attention she'd given to her father's account entries, looking for the pattern, the logic underneath the surface, what the thing revealed about the person doing it. Calder read terrain the way she read numbers continuously, automatically, with a running calculation she suspected he wasn't always consciously aware of. Every time the trail presented a question, he answered it, without appearing to deliberate. Every time his horse's stride changed in some subtle way, he adjusted before she could identify what he'd noticed. He'd learned this somewhere specific, not just from living in the mountains, from something that came before the mountains. She thought again about the journal and the name Joseph, and let the question sit where it was. 4 miles from the cabin, the trail descended into a long valley, and the country opened up in a way that felt, after the compressed terrain of the high route, almost disorienting. She could see for miles. She could see the gray-brown smear of what was probably Harrow's Crossing at the valley's eastern end, still distant but present, a destination that had been theoretical for 2 days and was now visible. 6 hours, Calder said when she pulled alongside him on the wider trail. If the lower trail is passable, it should be. Storm wouldn't have hit as hard at this elevation. He looked at the valley. Harrow's Crossing has 1 hotel and 2 saloons. We'll want the hotel. I have money. She'd packed it from the locked box in her father's desk. Not everything, but enough for a week of road travel. More if they were careful. My own money. I want to be clear about that. He glanced at her. I wasn't suggesting otherwise. I know. I'm being clear anyway. She looked at the distant buildings. Old habit. People assume. He said nothing for a moment. Then, your money, your decisions, that was your father's whole point. She nodded, and they rode on, and the valley opened ahead of them, cold and white and navigable, and Elowen began preparing mentally for what the land office might show them, and what they'd do with it when they knew. Harrow's Crossing was larger than the name suggested. Not a town exactly, more a substantial settlement that had accumulated around the intersection of two trade routes and decided to stay. The main street had a boardwalk, mostly intact, and the buildings were the particular mix of permanent and provisional that characterized places that weren't sure yet whether they were going to matter. The land office was a narrow building between a feed store and a harness shop, with a hand-painted sign that had been repainted recently, the letters still sharply legible, rather than faded to the general gray of the older storefronts around it. They left the horses at the livery at the street's western end and walked. Elowen carried the saddlebag with the ledger. The streets were still being dug out from the storm. Two men with shovels working the section in front of the general store, with the resigned efficiency of people who have done this before and expect to do it again. Nobody looked at them with particular attention. Two riders coming into town after a storm was ordinary. She was grateful for ordinary. The land office clerk was a compact man in his middle 50s, with the specific look of someone who takes his work seriously as a personal matter. He had the records organized in a way that suggested genuine investment cabinets labeled, indices maintained, a desk clear of everything except the business currently being conducted. He looked up when they came in without the particular wariness that characterized officials in Rourke's territory, and that absence of wariness told her something useful. "Help you," he said. "Archival records request," Elowen said. She'd decided on the walk from the livery that she would conduct this conversation, and Calder would stand back, because a woman making an archival request was less memorable than a man with a scar asking about land fraud. "I'm researching property transfers in Dunmore County over the past 5 years. State settlements, specifically. The clerk Piercy," she reminded herself, the man who had a grudge against Voss, and therefore a reason not to protect Rourke's paperwork, tilted his head. "Research for what purpose?" "Legal. I'm working on behalf of several families who believe their estate settlements were improperly processed." She kept her voice even and professional. "I have authorization to review archival records under territorial law, Section 14, which provides for interested parties in pending legal matters." "I know Section 14. He said it without impatience, the tone of a man who knows his own code and doesn't need the citation but appreciates that she knew it too. He studied her for a moment. "Which families?" She gave him 4 names from her father's ledger. Not the Hartwell name, not yet. Aldridge, Holloway, Brennan, and a 4th family named Kate whose case her father had documented most thoroughly. Piercy's expression shifted fractionally. Something tightened around his eyes. "The Aldridge transfer," he said slowly. "That one came through here." "Yes. I believe it would have been filed approximately 16 months ago." He was quiet for a moment that had weight to it. Then he stood and went to the cabinets at the back of the office without another word. She looked at Calder. He was standing by the door with his coat open and his expression neutral, and he gave her the smallest nod, the kind that means you're doing it right. "Keep going." Piercy returned with a folder. He laid it on the counter between them, opened it to a specific page, and turned it so she could read it. The Aldridge estate transfer was all there. The debt claim, the legal instruments, the property transfer to Meridian Grazing. Clean paperwork, well prepared. But there, on the 3rd page, under the witness attestation, the same comma placement she'd noticed in her father's forged debt note. The same hand. She controlled her reaction with the discipline that 4 years of keeping accounts had built in her. Numbers didn't reward visible excitement. Patterns didn't become more real because you showed them your feelings. "May I look at the Brennan transfer as well?" she asked. Piercy went back to the cabinets. He was moving with more deliberateness now, a quality of care that told her he understood something significant was happening without yet knowing what. He returned with 2 folders this time. She went through both. Same forger. Same hand in the witness attestation on the Brennan documents, and in the Kate transfer, and most importantly, she almost missed it. Caught it in the bottom margin of the Kate property transfer, a notation in the corner, in handwriting that didn't match the formal instrument text. Small, quick, the handwriting of someone making a private note they didn't intend to be read. An initial RC, she kept her face entirely still. RC could be many things. But in the context of Rourke's operation, in the corner of a fraudulent property transfer, the most probable two-word expansion was Rourke's forger. A name. She needed to find that name. Mr. Piercy, she said. These transfers were witnessed by the same individual across all 4 cases. The signature is consistent but difficult to read. She turned the folder and pointed to the witness line, where the signature was indeed a deliberate scrawless signature designed to be legally present but not easily legible. Do you have any record of who this witness actually was? Registry entries, anything that might clarify? Piercy looked at the signature for a long moment. The notation at the bottom, he said quietly. That initial. He stopped. A man came through here about 2 years ago. Filing assistant, working for a lawyer out of Dunmore. Name was Randall Corby. He said it carefully, like he was testing it. I remember him because he asked questions about how archival records could be amended. I told him they couldn't be, not without court order, and he seemed bothered by that. Elowen looked at the folder. Randall Corby, R.C. Did he have any connection to Cassian Rourke's bank? She asked. Piercy looked at her directly. Miss, he said, what is this actually about? She held his gaze. She'd prepared for this moment, too, the decision about how much to tell and when and to whom. It's about a forged debt used to seize my family's ranch after my father was murdered, she said, and about 6 other families in 3 counties who lost their land the same way, and about evidence that points to Cassian Rourke as the architect of all of it. She paused. I am going to the territorial court with this evidence. What I need from you is confirmation of what I've found in these records, and the name of someone at the court I can trust to hear it. The office was very quiet. Piercy looked at the folders on his counter. He looked at the wall above them, where a territorial map was pinned with county lines marked in red. He looked like a man doing a private accounting of his own courage. Judge Haynes, he said finally. Colbert Haynes at the territorial seat. He's honest. Stubborn about it, which is the important part. He closed the folders carefully. I want copies of what you found. Official copies, stamped with this office's seal, so there's a record that this evidence existed before you leave town. You'd do that? She asked. I've known about the Aldridge transfer for 14 months, he said. I've known something was wrong with it, and I've had nobody to tell who could do anything about it. He looked at her steadily. Yes, I'll do that. He spent the next 2 hours making certified copies of every relevant document. Elowen sat at the counter and cross-referenced them against her father's ledger, building the documented chain link by link. Calder stood by the door and watched the street, with the unhurried attention of a man who has learned to keep track of what's outside while working indoors. When they left the land office, Elowen had a second saddlebag's worth of documentation and the name of a forger. She also had the beginning of something she hadn't let herself name yet, because naming it too early was the kind of mistake that made people careless. It felt like the approaching edge of justice. They were at the hotel when the man from Voss's office found them. Not Voss himself, not Kane, a younger man, early 20s, with the self-conscious authority of someone who has been given an important errand and is trying to look like he gives these errands often. He walked into the hotel dining room where they were eating, the first real meal in 2 days. Plain food that tasted extraordinary in the way plain food does after sustained cold and effort, and he looked at Elowen with the particular expression of a person confirming an identification. He sat down at the table without being invited. Elowen put her fork down. Calder did not put his down, but he shifted his weight in the particular way that changed nothing visible and rearranged everything. Marshal Voss sends his regards, the young man said. He had a letter in his breast pocket. She could see the folded edge. He asks that you consider returning to Dunmore to discuss the legal situation. In a spirit of resolution, does he? Elowen said. He believes there may be misunderstandings that could be cleared up with the right conversation. The misunderstanding, she said, is that my father's signature was forged on a debt he never owed, and that the marshal whose job it is to prevent that kind of fraud is the person who helped file it. She picked up her fork. What exactly does he imagine there is to discuss? The young man's composure developed a crack. He'd been briefed for a cooperative woman. She could see it. He'd been briefed for someone who would receive an offer and consider it, and he had no preparation for someone who declined the premise entirely. There's also the matter, he said, recovering, of stolen property. Records removed from the Hartwell estate before legal proceedings were finalized. My father's private account records, she said, are not property of an estate in debt settlement. They are personal documents of a deceased individual, and I, as his daughter and closest surviving family, have every legal right to them. She looked at him steadily. I know this because I looked it up. Territorial Code, Section 9, Subsection 4. Would you like me to cite the case law? He was 22 years old, and he had not expected this. None of them ever expected this. That was the thing about being underestimated. The expectation itself was the opening. Marshal Voss, tell Marshal Voss that I am proceeding with my legal right to petition the territorial court. She set her fork down again, deliberately this time. And tell him that if anyone interferes with my travel or my evidence between here and the territorial seat, I will add obstruction of justice to the list of charges I'm filing. She picked her fork back up. He can expect to hear from Judge Haynes's office in approximately 2 weeks. I'd suggest he use the time productively. The young man left. Calder watched him go through the front window. He'll send a message ahead. I know, she ate. How far ahead do you think Rourke's people can move? Maddox Kane is probably already in the territory somewhere between here and the court. He drank his coffee, his eyes still on the window. Kane doesn't travel slow. She thought about what she knew of Kane from the fragments in her father's ledger, not direct documentation, but the shape of him visible in the aftermath of situations her father had tracked. Kind of man who resolved problems before they became problems, which was a different thing from solving them, and a considerably more frightening one. Does he know this country? She asked. As well as I do, maybe better. He finally looked away from the window. The canyon route to the territorial seat goes through some narrow sections. 3 of them. If Kane gets ahead of us, those are where he'd be. She thought about this, about the 3 narrow sections and a man who resolved problems early. We can't go around, she said. Not in this weather. The high routes are closed. Then we go through. She finished eating. And we don't let him get ahead of us. How do we move faster than he can move to intercept? Calder looked at her with the expression she'd seen in Red Hollow and in the kitchen and on the trail, the one that was recalculating something based on new information. We leave tonight instead of tomorrow morning, he said. Dark, in the dark. Kane won't expect that. He'll set up where he thinks we'll be when he estimates we'll arrive. If we move 6 hours earlier, we change the geometry of the intercept. She understood this the way she understood account structures. The position of the numbers relative to each other determined the outcome. Where does that put us at the first canyon section? Pre-dawn, which is actually better cover than midday. She nodded. How much rest do the horses need? Feed them well and rest them 4 hours. That'll do. Then we eat, we sleep 2 hours, and we move at midnight. She looked at him. Can you navigate that route in the dark? The question sat between them for a moment. I've done it once, he said, in worse conditions. That's not a no. No, he agreed, it's not a no. They moved at midnight, as agreed, with the cold so complete and specific that breathing required a kind of mental preparation. The horses were rested and fed and profoundly unenthusiastic about the proposition of midnight travel, and Elowen gave her mare the time required to accept it, not rushing the adjustment, not forcing compliance, but making it clear through consistent, steady pressure that the movement was happening, regardless of the mare's opinion on the matter. The mare accepted it eventually. She always did. The night travel was a different kind of difficult than the daylight travel had been. There was no weather to fight, but there was the constant, low-level demand of moving through darkness in country that rewarded inattention with broken ankles and worse. Calder moved slowly, deliberately, with a handheld lantern on the most technical sections that was enough light to navigate by, and not enough to advertise their presence at any distance. She stayed close behind him, and she trusted the horses, who could see more than they could, and whose accumulated sense of self-preservation was an asset in conditions like these. Her mare followed the stallion with a focus that suggested she'd decided if the big horse thought it was safe. She was willing to proceed on that recommendation. For 3 hours they moved like this, almost no talking. The cold and the dark and the terrain required their full attention, and the silence had the quality of something shared rather than absent two people concentrating on the same problem, aware of each other without needing to confirm it. The first canyon came up around 3 in the morning. Elowen saw it before Calder stopped. The walls closing in, the trail narrowing to barely 2 horses' width, the darkness inside the canyon a different quality than the darkness outside it. More contained, more directional. Calder stopped at the entrance and turned in the saddle. "Half a mile through," he said quietly. "Listen for anything that isn't us." She nodded. They entered the canyon. The cold in there was different, sharper, stored in the rock walls the way cold stores in stone, radiating out against them as they passed. The stallion's hooves on the frozen ground, it made sounds that multiplied off the walls, and Elowen concentrated on hearing past them on the layer of sound underneath the sound they were making. Quarter-mile in, the stallion's ears went forward. She saw it happen and felt her own body respond. Not quite fear, the thing that's adjacent to fear when you are moving and must continue moving regardless of what's ahead. Calder stopped. They both listened. Nothing. Just the wind at the canyon's far end, and the small sounds of 2 horses breathing and shifting their weight. Then, not nothing. A stone displaced. A small sound, the sound of something settling after a disturbance. The way a sound is sometimes the echo of a movement that's already finished. Someone had been there. Recently enough that the cold air still held the shape of the disturbance. Calder didn't speak. He made a gesture with his free hand, something she interpreted, correctly as it turned out, as move forward, stay close. They moved forward. The far end of the canyon opened up 50 yards ahead, and as they came out of the narrow section into the wider trail beyond, Elowen exhaled through her teeth and realized she'd been holding her breath for the last 2 minutes. "Someone was in there," she said. "Someone is following us. Not ahead of us," he said. That sound was behind our position, not forward of it. Which means we moved before they expected. She looked back at the canyon mouth. "They're tracking us. They haven't overtaken us yet. But they know we're moving at night now." He looked ahead, then behind. "Can't slow down. We weren't planning to." They moved faster after that, as fast as the darkness and the terrain permitted, and the night was long and cold and demanded everything. And Elowen gave it everything she had, without reserving anything for complaint. Dawn came the way dawn comes in mountain country, not gradually but decisively, as if the darkness finally conceded the argument. With the light came the second canyon, and with the second canyon came Maddox Kane. She saw him at the canyon entrance, not inside it, waiting, but at its mouth, blocking it, him and 2 riders she didn't recognize. All 3 mounted and positioned with the specific arrangement of people who have arrived early and have had time to choose their ground. Kane was not what she'd expected from her father's fragmentary documentation. She'd built a mental image of something heavier, more overtly threatening. The man at the canyon entrance was spare and unhurried, with the quiet of something genuinely dangerous. Not the performed quiet of men who want to seem dangerous, but the settled stillness of someone who has stopped needing to prove the point. He looked at them. He looked specifically at Elowen, at her saddlebag she noted, not at her face. He knew about the ledger, Miss Hartwell. His voice was conversational, almost pleasant. "You've had quite a ride, cold night." "It was," she said. She stopped her mare 12 feet from him, which was close enough to talk and far enough that nobody had to move quickly yet. "Mr. Kane, I assume?" "That's right." He seemed mildly surprised that she knew the name. "I'm just here to save you a difficult journey, Mr. Rourke is prepared to be generous. The Hartwell estate would be returned free and clear, and there'd be compensation for your trouble. All we need is what you've been carrying." "The ledger," she said. "The ledger," he agreed. She looked at him. She looked at the 2 riders flanking him, positioned to prevent movement left or right. She looked at the canyon behind him, the only direct route to the territorial seat that didn't add 3 days to their journey. She thought very quickly, with the specific speed her mind achieved when the problem had a deadline. Then she did something Kane was not expecting. She walked her horse forward. Not charging, walking. Toward him. at an angle that carried her slightly left of center toward the canyon wall side where the terrain was roughest, and the riders were positioned farthest from each other. Kane's horse shifted and Kane controlled it, and in that fractional moment of his attention on his own animal, she passed his left flank close enough that the distance was uncomfortable for everyone involved. And kept going. She was in the canyon before Kane had fully processed what had happened. Behind her, she heard his voice, sharp now, the pleasantness gone. Calder don't. And then Calder was in the canyon, too, his stallion at speed, because whatever else Bram Calder was, he was not a man who waited to see how a situation resolved when someone he was responsible for had already moved. Kane's men came in after them. She heard the hoofbeats, echo multiplied by the canyon walls into something that sounded like considerably more horses than there were. She didn't look back. She rode. The canyon was not half a mile as the first one had been. It was longer, a full mile, maybe more, with sections that curved so she couldn't see ahead, and sections that narrowed further, so that riding fast was genuinely technical, requiring the horse to choose its own footing at a speed that punished the wrong choice. Her mare chose well. She always had. 800 yards in, the canyon bent hard left, and the trail opened briefly onto a shallow ledge overlooking a fast-moving river 30 feet below. Not a cliff, not suicidal, but the kind of drop that made the outcome of a fall specific. Pulled up there. Calder came around the bend and pulled up beside her. He looked at her, then past her at the river, then back toward the canyon bend behind them. "They're coming," he said. "I know." She was already unbuckling the saddlebag. "Give me your word." "What? Your word, right now." "That if this goes wrong, you get to Harrow's Crossing, and you get Piercy's copies to Judge Haynes. The copies in your bag." She'd insisted on this before they left. The split documentation, the backup she'd made in the cabin. "Give me your word." He looked at her with an expression that was doing several things at once. "What are you planning?" "I'm planning to make sure we have leverage." She pulled the ledger from the saddlebag. Not the copies, the original. Her father's 11 months of careful work. "Your word first. You have it." He said it without hesitation, which told her something. Turned her horse to face the canyon bend and held the ledger over the river. Kane came around the bend 30 seconds later with his two riders and pulled up hard when he saw the position saw Calder on one side and Elowen on the other with the ledger extended over 30 feet of empty air and fast water. Stopped. His horse didn't want to stop and he made it anyway. He looked at the ledger. Miss Hartwell. The pleasantness was entirely gone now. What was underneath it was colder and more honest. "That's not a reasonable, Mr. Kane." She kept her voice level with a focused effort she wouldn't let show. "I understand what that ledger means to Rourke. I understand that it's the thing he's most afraid of. I understand that you are here because of it and that your only value to him in this moment is retrieving it." She looked at him steadily. "So I need you to understand what happens if you come one step closer. Everything your employer has spent 5 years trying to hide disappears into that river, and Rourke loses the one thing he cannot manufacture, the original documentation of his own crimes, in my father's own hand." She paused. "So ask yourself whether your instructions cover this specific situation." Kane was still, not the stillness of someone in control, the stillness of someone recalculating. She knew she had approximately the length of that recalculation to work with. "You can't get to the territorial court," he said. "You know that. You got through both canyons, but there's a third one. And after that there are open miles where—" "I know about the third canyon," she said. "Which is why this is the conversation we're having right now." She looked at him. Not with the performance of courage, with the actual thing, the thing underneath performance, the thing that had been building in her, since the moment she'd read her father's capital G on a forged signature, understood what it meant. "You have approximately 10 seconds to decide whether you are willing to spend the rest of your life explaining to Cassian Rourke how you caused him to lose the only evidence that could destroy him." Kane's jaw worked. "Or," she said, "you ride back to whoever you reported to this morning, and you tell them that the situation is more complicated than anticipated and requires new instructions. And in the time it takes those instructions to arrive." She pulled the ledger back, slowly, deliberately, and set it on the saddle in front of her. "We are through the third canyon and standing in front of Judge Colbert Haynes." Canyon was silent except for the river below. One of Kane's riders looked at Kane. Kane's face had gone through several things while she was talking and had arrived somewhere that wasn't resolution. It was more like a man who has recognized a problem he didn't bring the right tools for. He turned his horse. "We'll meet again, Miss Hartwell," he said. His voice had something in it that was neither threat nor promise, just the statement of a man who is good at his work and has not finished the job. "I expect so," she said. He rode back through the canyon with his two riders, and the sound of their hooves diminished around the bend and faded, and Elowen sat on her mare with the ledger on the saddle and breathed. Calder was looking at her. She looked back. That was he started. "Don't." She secured the ledger. "Let's move before he changes his mind." "Elowen, I was frightened," she said, because he was going to say something about courage, and she didn't want to receive it. "My hands were shaking the entire time. I couldn't let them see it. That's all that was." He was quiet for a moment. The river made it sound below. Somewhere past the canyon's end, the third narrow section waited, and past that the territorial seat, and past that a courtroom where a judge named Haynes would either be brave enough or not. "Your hands weren't shaking," Calder said. She looked at him. "I was watching," he said. "Your hands were entirely still." She didn't have an answer for that. She moved her horse forward instead, back into the canyon, back toward the route they'd been given and intended to keep. Behind her, she heard Calder follow. And later, when they'd cleared the third canyon without incident, when the high country finally released them into the broader terrain of the territorial valley, she allowed herself to feel, briefly and privately, the thing she'd been refusing to feel since she'd held her father's ledger over 30 feet of moving water. Not triumph. Something smaller and more honest than triumph. Specific, hard-won knowledge that she had not broken. That the world had shown her one of its worst moments, her father dead, her land stolen, her body mocked in a public square, and she had not broken, and she was still moving forward, with the evidence intact and the road ahead of her, and that was enough. That was for now entirely enough. The territorial seat appeared on the horizon 2 hours later, the courthouse building visible from a distance, the way important things sometimes are, not large, not dramatic, just present. Solid against the pale winter sky, exactly where it was supposed to be. Elowen Hartwell looked at it without slowing her horse. She had a ledger, a forger's name, certified copies from an honest land office clerk, and a dead man's careful handwriting that told the truth about everything. She also had Bram Calder riding beside her, which she was beginning to understand was not an insignificant thing. She rode toward the courthouse with both. The territorial courthouse was a 2-story stone building that had been constructed to communicate permanence in a territory that hadn't yet decided if it was permanent. It sat at the end of the main street, like a period at the end of a sentence, deliberate, final, the kind of architecture that was meant to remind people that some things didn't move regardless of who pushed. Elowen looked at it for exactly as long as it took her mare to walk the last 100 yards of the road. Then she looked at the horses, because the horses needed attention, and the courthouse would still be there once the horses were attended to. Calder had already identified the livery before she asked. He did that, anticipated the practical next step, without making a presentation of it, which she'd come to recognize as a form of consideration more useful than most people's more visible efforts. They left the horses with water and feed and walked back to the courthouse through the main street's late afternoon cold, and Elowen carried the saddlebag with the ledger and did not let herself think too far ahead, because thinking too far ahead was how you tripped on the ground directly in front of you. The courthouse clerk was a young man who was very proud of his position and expressed this through a particular quality of gatekeeping, the way he managed his desk and the space in front of it as if the papers on it were personally precious rather than public documents. He looked at them when they came through the door and began constructing an expression that was going to involve explaining that Judge Haynes was unavailable. "I need to file a formal complaint for court review," Elowen said before he opened his mouth. "Land fraud, forgery, and murder across 3 counties. I have documentary evidence." She set the saddlebag on his counter. "And I need to speak with Judge Haynes today." The clerk's expression had arrived at its destination, but discovered the destination wasn't quite what he'd planned. "The judge's calendar is his own business," she agreed. "Tell him Gideon Hartwell's daughter is here with Gideon Hartwell's records, and that Cassian's men tried to stop her from arriving. He can decide whether that merits 15 minutes of his calendar. Clerk looked at her. He looked at Calder, standing slightly behind her left shoulder in the particular way that was not threatening and did not need to be. He looked back at Elowen. He went through the door behind his desk. She stood at the counter and breathed and did not let herself sit down, because sitting down was what you did when you had arrived, and she had not arrived yet. Calder stood beside her without speaking, which was what she needed, and the courthouse clock on the wall above the clerk's desk moved its hands, and she watched it, and did not count the seconds aloud. 8 minutes later, the clerk came back and said Judge Haynes would see them. Colbert Haynes was not what she'd built from Calder's description and Piercy's recommendation. She'd assembled a mental image older, perhaps, more visibly the stubborn, honest man of reputation. The actual Haynes was late 50s, stocky, with the particular gray tiredness of someone who has been dealing with other people's worst decisions for many years and has learned to live inside that tiredness rather than fight it. He wore his coat still on, which told her he'd been about to leave when the clerk interrupted him, and he hadn't taken it off, which told her he hadn't yet decided whether to stay. He looked at them both when they came in, the evaluating look of a man who has been presented with people in crisis before and has learned to look past the crisis to what's actually there. "Sit down," he said. It wasn't warm and it wasn't unkind. It was just an efficient instruction. She sat. Calder sat beside her. Put the ledger on the desk. She put Piercy's certified copies beside it. Put her own annotated comparative handwriting analysis beside that. Haynes looked at the materials on his desk. He looked at her. "Tell me," he said. She told him. Not everything at once. She'd planned the sequence the way she planned an account presentation, moving from the clear and established to the complex and inferential, building the structure so each piece supported the next. She started with the forgery, because forgery was concrete and demonstrable, and didn't require him to take her word for anything. She could show him. She showed him. She showed him her father's genuine handwriting from dated letters and account entries alongside the forged signature, pointed to the capital G, pointed to the comma placement that appeared in every fraudulent document, pointed to the initials in the corner of the Kate transfer. Haynes did not interrupt. He looked at what she showed him with the focused attention of a man who understands documents, and she could see him seeing it the moment when the comparison registered, when his expression shifted from the professionally neutral to something more active. "Randall Corby," she said, "the forger. He came through Harrow's Crossing Land Office 2 years ago asking questions about how archival records could be amended. Clerk there identified him. Piercy," Haynes said. "Yes, I know Piercy." He looked at the certified copies. "These are his stamps, yes." Haynes was quiet for a moment. Not the recalculating quiet of Cain in the canyon, not the uncomfortable quiet of the men in Red Hollow's square. The working quiet of a person actually thinking. "Rourke has lawyers," he said finally. Expensive ones. They'll challenge every document, challenge Piercy's identification, challenge your qualifications to testify to handwriting analysis. "I know. They'll argue that your father's records are personal documents with no evidentiary standing, prepared by an interested party with motivation to fabricate. I know that too." She kept her voice steady. "Which is why I need the court to subpoena the county records from Dunmore. The originals that Rourke's lawyers filed those have Corby's handwriting in the witness attestations. And I need the court to compel testimony from a man named Corbett, who works in Voss's office and who witnessed the Hartwell debt note. He's been waiting for someone to give him a structure he can testify inside safely." Haynes looked at her for a long moment. "You know a great deal about legal procedure for someone who isn't a lawyer. My father spent 30 years in a territory where the law was the only protection available to people without money or guns," she said. "He read the code the way other men read the Bible. Taught me." She paused. He was thorough. Something moved through Haynes's expression. "Gideon Hartwell." He said the name with a quality she hadn't expected recognition, not just acknowledgement. "He sent me a letter. 8 months ago." She went still. "He wrote to you?" "He did. He didn't sign it. It was anonymous, which told me he was frightened, which told me the situation was real." Haynes leaned back. "He described what he'd found in general terms. Didn't send documentation, said he wasn't ready, said he was still building the case. Asked if I was independent of Rourke's influence." He paused. I wrote back to the address he'd provided. The letter was never claimed. The implications of this assembled themselves quietly in Elowen's chest. Her father had known about Haynes. Her father had been moving toward this office, had been building towards exactly this conversation, and had been killed before he could complete the journey. She'd completed it for him. He's been dead 5 weeks, she said. I know. Haynes looked at the ledger. I heard. I suspected. He looked at her. When did you find out? That it wasn't an accident. I knew from the moment they told me where they found him. She kept her voice level. He'd ridden that trail 30 years. He knew every rock on it. Haynes was quiet again. Then he straightened and picked up the ledger with the careful manner of a man handling evidence. I'm going to need to read everything tonight, he said. I want Piercy here. I'll send for him. I want a court recorder in this room tomorrow morning. And I want you to write out your full account of Maddox Kane's attempt to intercept you, in your own words, with specific locations and timing. She had not expected it to move this fast. She had braced for obstruction, for the careful distance of a man weighing his options. You're opening an investigation, she said. I'm opening a review, he said. An investigation requires more process. A review I can open tonight with what you've brought me. He set the ledger down. Your father spent almost a year on this. I won't disrespect that by moving slowly when I don't have to. She looked at him. She looked at the tiredness in his face, the professional gray of it, and beneath it something that had clearly been there a long time, maintained and banked against the moment it would be needed. Thank you, she said. It came out slightly more raw than she intended. Don't thank me yet, he said, not unkindly. Rourke's lawyers are very good. This is a long road. I know long road, she said. Haynes almost smiled. I can see that. They were given rooms at the courthouse's small attached residence, which was used for witnesses and officials traveling through. The rooms were plain and clean and warm, which was everything necessary. Elowen spent the evening writing her account of the canyon confrontation with Kane, every detail she could reconstruct, in the precise sequential order her memory supplied them, which was good because she'd been trained on precision, and the last 3 days had been the kind of experience that burned itself into specific clarity. She wrote until her hand ached, then flexed it and kept writing. Calder knocked on her door around 9. She opened it. He had 2 tin mugs of coffee, one of which he held out to her with the same lack of ceremony he'd held out the cornbread on the morning they left his ranch, and she took it with the same lack of ceremony and stepped back to let him in. He sat in the chair by the window. She sat on the edge of the bed with her papers in her lap. The coffee was good, strong, and unsentimental, the way she'd come to associate with him. Haynes is reading it, Calder said. I saw the light under his office door. Good. She looked at her papers. Corbett, the clerk from Voss's office. We need him to agree to testify before Rourke knows this review is opening. I've been thinking about that. He turned the mug in his hands, a gesture she recognized, the physical equivalent of working through something. There's a man at the livery. His brother works adjacent to Voss's territory. If I leave early tomorrow, I can reach a relay point and get a message to Corbett without it going through any of Rourke's people. That's 2 days minimum. Can Corbett get here safely? Not through Dunmore. But there's a circuit road that comes east without touching any of Rourke's regular routes. He paused. Thaddeus Wren. She looked up. Who? Former lawman. Retired 7 years ago to a spread about 40 miles from the territorial seat. He spent 20 years running warrants in this territory and knows every back road in it. He has no stake in Rourke's operation, actually has some history with Voss that makes him actively motivated to see Voss removed. He looked at the window. If Wren is willing to bring Corbett in, nobody in Rourke's network would know until they were already at the courthouse. You know Wren? I know of him. My brother, he stopped. The word landed in the room and he let it stay there, which was different from the careful economy of his usual speech, and she understood that something had just been offered that was not usually offered. She didn't rush toward it. Your brother knew him? She asked carefully. My brother worked with him, before. He looked at the mug. Wren knows who I am. He knew my brother. Whether that's an asset or a problem, I can't fully predict, but I think it's more asset than problem. Thought about the journal in the desk drawer and the name Joseph. She thought about 7 years alone on a mountain and a reputation that frightened people, and the particular way Calder had said the word brother, as if it cost something. Would he help us? She asked. I think so. If the ask comes from me and if I explain what we have. He paused. I'd need to explain some things to him that I haven't explained to anyone in a long time. She looked at him. He was looking at the window, at the dark glass that reflected the room back at them in a dim amber version of itself. You don't have to tell me what those things are, she said. I know. He was quiet for a moment. My brother was killed 6 years ago. He was working a warrant with legitimate law work. Nothing complicated. A man Rourke had employed at the time went after the wrong person, and Joseph was in the way. He said it flatly, but the flatness had the particular quality of something that has been compressed very hard and very deliberately into a manageable shape. Rourke wasn't directly responsible. The man who did it was in prison within the year. But the reason that man was in that place at that time was Rourke's money and Rourke's instruction, and I knew it, and there was no legal mechanism available to me that I trusted to do anything about it. It was very still. So you went up the mountain, she said. So I went up the mountain. He looked at the mug again. Before I did something that would have ended badly for me and done nothing for Joseph. Thought about this. About 6 years of watching Rourke's operations from the elevated distance of a mountain, unable to act, keeping himself in check through sheer isolation. About her father appearing at his door with a ledger and a plan. My father knew, she said. About your brother, he found out. I don't know how your father found out most things eventually. A pause. He didn't tell me he knew. He just came up the mountain with his evidence and said there was a person who could use it to do something real, and would I help keep it safe? He was using you, she said, not as accusation, as observation. We were using each other. He almost smiled. Not quite, but the shape of it. I had the isolation and the reputation. He had the documentation. Neither was sufficient without the other. She looked at her hands on her papers. Did he know what he was asking? That it might end. He knew exactly what he was asking, Calder said. He told me so. He said, Bram, this is dangerous, and I'm asking you to step into it with full knowledge of that. Then he told me about you. For 3 hours, she breathed. Go find Wren, she said. Tomorrow morning. Tell him whatever you need to tell him. If he can get Corbett here safely, that testimony could be the difference between a review that leads somewhere and one that gets buried under Rourke's legal team. He nodded. Get some sleep, he said, standing. Haynes is going to want you in the morning. I have 3 more pages to write. Write them, then sleep. She looked up at him. He was standing with the empty mug, and in the lamplight, the scar along his jaw was visible, and the years in it and the reasons for it. And she understood very specifically why her father had climbed this particular mountain and trusted this particular man with the most important thing he had to give. Calder, she said. He stopped at the door. Joseph would have wanted this, she said. Whatever that's worth. He stood with that for a moment. His hand was on the doorframe, and his back was to her, and she couldn't see his face. It's worth something, he said. Good night, Elowen. He left. She went back to her papers and wrote the last 3 pages, and then slept without meaning to, this time, in an actual bed, and for the first time since her father died, she dreamed about something other than the auction platform. Haynes opened the formal review at 8 the next morning. He had read everything. She could see it in the quality of his question-specific drilling into the sections of her father's documentation that were inferential rather than directly evidenced. He knew the weak points. He'd spent the night finding them. The Meridian grazing connection, he said. They were in his office with a recorder present, an older woman named Mrs. Alcott, who wrote shorthand with the concentrated efficiency of someone who has been doing it for 40 years and has made her peace with whatever she hears in the process. Your father documented the pattern of acquisition, but the direct link between Meridian grazing and Rourke himself is a single corporate instrument. Rourke's lawyers will argue he's a passive investor. The account numbers, Elowen said. She'd anticipated this. On pages 41 through 43 of the ledger, my father tracked the money flow from the forged debt payments through 3 intermediary accounts. The third account has deposits that correspond, within the same banking week, to withdrawals from Rourke's personal account at his own bank. She paused. That's not passive investment. That's active receipt of fraudulent proceeds. Haynes looked at the pages. How did your father access Rourke's personal banking records? He didn't. He accessed the bank's public filings, which cattle banks are required by territorial law to submit quarterly. And he had a source inside the bank, a teller, who was troubled by what he was processing and gave my father partial figures. She paused. The teller's name is in the back of the ledger. He'd need to be contacted and protected before Rourke knows this review is happening. Haynes wrote something. I can have a court officer at that bank today. Before noon would be better. He looked at her. I'm aware. I know. She stopped. I'm sorry. I'm not trying to tell you your process. You're trying to protect your father's work, he said, not unkindly. I understand the impulse. He set his pen down. Miss Hartwell. I've been on this bench for 12 years. I've seen evidence presented by lawyers who were paid handsomely to present it, and I've seen evidence presented by people who built it themselves from scratch because they were the only ones who could. In my experience, the second kind is usually more reliable. He looked at the ledger. Your father built something real. You reinforced it. My job is to make sure it doesn't get destroyed by procedural arguments before it can do what it's supposed to do. She looked at him. So he said, picking up his pen again. The teller, give me the name. She gave him the name. He sent a court officer within the hour. Lenora arrived on the second day. Elowen was in the courthouse library, a narrow room of legal references and territorial records that Haynes had given her access to, where she'd been working through the corporate instrument chain for meridian grazing, with the focused intensity of thought, and his following who's found the thread dominant regardless of where it goes. When the clerk came to tell her, there was a woman asking for her at the front door. She'd assumed it would be someone from Rourke, a lawyer perhaps, serving some procedural challenge. She'd braced for that and moved through the courthouse corridor with the saddlebag over her shoulder out of habit, the habit of keeping her evidence close. It was Lenora, standing in the courthouse entrance in her traveling coat, which was as precisely maintained as everything about her, but showed, for the first time Elowen could recall, the specific disarray of someone who had ridden hard and not rested adequately. Her hair was not perfect. Her eyes were red in a way that wasn't the handkerchief against the cheekbone red of the funeral. She looked like a woman who had made a decision she wasn't certain about and had ridden toward it anyway before she could reconsider. Elowen stopped in the corridor. They looked at each other across 20 feet of stone floor. How did you know where I was? Elowen asked. Red Hollow knows, Lenora said. People talk. Someone saw you leave with Calder. Someone else heard you'd been to Harrow's Crossing. She paused. And I know you. I know what your father would have done, and I know you would have done the same thing, because you are exactly like him in every way that matters. Don't. Elowen heard the edge in her own voice. Don't tell me I'm like him and expect that. I'm not trying to soften anything. Lenora's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that was less steady, something she was holding with effort. I owe you the truth. I came here to give it to you. The courthouse clock made its sound in the room above. Come in, Elowen said finally. She took her to the small room Haynes had assigned her, not because she trusted Lenora, but because she understood, from reading people the way she read accounts, that the woman in the corridor was there for a reason that was going to matter. And the only way to find out what it was to listen to it. Lenora sat in the chair Calder had occupied 2 nights ago. She told Elowen everything. Not in the careful, managed way she'd told things in the parlor with Rourke's lawyers present. Not the performance of a woman managing a difficult situation. She told it the way a person tells something they've been carrying alone for a long time and have finally decided to put down. Her younger sister's name was Clara. Clara and her husband had owned a small ranch in a neighboring county, and Cassian Rourke had taken it from them 7 years ago with the same mechanism he'd used on the Hartwells, a forged debt, a corrupt local official, an auction. Clara's husband hadn't survived the year after. Clara had come to Lenora with nothing. I spent 2 years trying to find a legal avenue, Lenora said. There wasn't one that didn't go through officials Rourke controlled. And then I met your father. She looked at her hands as in her lap. He was in the county seat, asking questions about property transfers. We recognized in each other. I'm not sure how to describe it. The recognition of someone else who is angry about the same thing and hasn't found a way to act on it. Elowen was very still. You married him to work together. We married each other because we trusted each other, and because the arrangement gave us each access to information we didn't have alone. She paused. And because he was a good man. And I am grateful that I knew him. Something crossed her face that Elowen had no category for yet. Some complicated private grief that had been living quietly inside Lenora's composure this whole time. What I did at the auction staging it that way, not stopping it when I could have. Explain that, Elowen said. Her voice came out harder than she intended. Because I need to understand that specifically. Lenora met her eyes. Rourke's men were watching the house from the night your father died. I couldn't get you out quietly. Any attempt to move you would have looked like flight and given them grounds to file an emergency restraint. The indenture claim gave me a legal mechanism to transfer custody of you to a third party who wasn't under observation. She paused. I had 3 people identified who I trusted to purchase the indenture and bring you somewhere safe. I had a plan. Calder wasn't your plan. Calder was faster than my plan. Something that might, in a different woman, have been dark humor move through her expression. And given the result, I'm not inclined to argue with his timing. Elowen thought about standing on the auction platform, about the crowd, about the specific sounds of men she'd known her whole life, deciding she was a reasonable target for entertainment. You let that happen, she said. I let you be publicly present in a way that created a legal record of the transfer, Lenora said. The humiliation. She stopped. I underestimated what that would feel like. To watch and not stop it. She looked at the window. That is the thing I cannot adequately account for, Elowen. I can explain the strategy. I cannot explain away what it cost you. The room was quiet. Elowen looked at the ledger on the table. She thought about her father sitting at Lenora's kitchen table, or Lenora at his going through records together, building a case together, trusting each other with the most dangerous thing either of them had. She thought about how thoroughly her father had hidden this from her, and how thoroughly Lenora had maintained the performance of the cold, calculating stepmother, and how much work that had required from both of them. She thought about what it meant that Lenora had ridden hard to get here. Can you testify? Elowen asked. Lenora looked at her. Something moved through her face. Not surprise exactly, more like the recognition of a question from someone who thinks the way you think. Yes, she said, I have my own records. Not as complete as your father's, but they covered different angles, conversations, meetings, things I witnessed personally that can't be documented any other way. She paused. And I can testify to Rourke's specific threat against you after your father died. Told me, directly, that if anyone used Gideon's records to challenge his claims, you would not reach the courthouse. She looked at Elowen steadily. That's a direct threat against a witness. That carries its own legal weight. Elowen stood and went to the door. She knocked twice on the wall, the signal she'd established with Haynes's clerk for when she needed the judge's attention. She turned back to Lenora. I'm not going to tell you we're fine, she said. We aren't fine. What happened between us has damage in it that will take a long time to account for. She looked at the woman in the chair, at the red eyes and the imperfect hair and the 2 years of carrying an impossible performance alone. But my father trusted you, and my father was almost always right about things. She paused. So you're going to sit in that chair and wait for Judge Haynes, and you're going to tell him everything you just told me, and then we'll see where we are. Lenora nodded. She didn't thank her, which was the right decision. Haynes came within 10 minutes. The formal hearing opened 4 days later. In that 4 days, Calder returned with Thaddeus Wren, who was a weathered man in his late 60s, who walked with a slight drag in his left leg from an old injury and had the particular authority of someone who has spent a long career making things happen in difficult circumstances and has no patience for obstacles that aren't genuine. He brought Corbett, the clerk from Voss's office, in a covered wagon along the circuit road, arriving at the courthouse's back entrance in the early morning, while Rourke's men, who had established a visible observation of the front of the courthouse, were watching the wrong door. Corbett was 28 years old and terrified, and had clearly been terrified for 3 years. carrying the weight of what he'd witnessed and signed and processed on behalf of Voss, with the specific hunched quality of a man and whose conscience has been too large for his courage. He sat across from Elowen in the courthouse anteroom and looked at his hands and told her, in a voice that kept finding and then losing its steadiness, exactly what he'd seen and done. He'd witnessed 3 forged debt instruments. He'd signed as a notary. He'd seen Randall Corby in Voss's office on 4 occasions, always arriving after hours and leaving with sealed documents. When Elowen showed him the handwriting comparison her father's genuine entries alongside the forged signatures, he looked at it for a long time. "The G," he said. "I noticed the G on the Hartwell note. I told myself maybe people's handwriting changes." He looked up at her. "I knew it wasn't right. I signed it anyway. You were in a difficult position," she said. "I was a coward," he said. The self-judgment was flat and practiced, the verdict of a man who'd been issuing it privately for a long time. She looked at him. "You're here now." He looked back at her. Some of the hunched quality shifted. "I'm here now," he agreed. Wren spent the 4 days doing something equally important. He sent messages to the ranchers whose cases appeared in her father's ledger. Not demanding testimony explaining what was happening, what evidence existed, what a court review might mean. He wrote the letters himself, in the plain direct language of a man who had spent 20 years explaining legal situations to people who'd been unharmed and needed to understand their options. By the morning the formal hearing opened, 3 of those families had arrived. By the second day of the hearing, 2 more had sent written statements. By the third day, the courtroom had standing room only. Elowen took the witness stand on the morning of the third day. She'd been preparing for this since the night she'd stayed up reading her father's ledger by lamplight. And in a different sense, she'd been preparing for it her whole life, trained by her father on precision, on patience, on the discipline of presenting what was real in a way that couldn't be argued with. She arranged her materials on the stand with the same care she'd always brought to a complicated account presentation. She looked out at the courtroom. Several men who had been in Red Hollow's square on the morning of the auction were in the gallery. She recognized them. She'd expected them to be there, because people who benefit from a corrupt system find their way to the proceedings that might undo it, some out of fear, some out of calculation, some out of the specific fascination of watching an outcome that affects them. None of them were laughing. She began. She spoke for 4 hours without significant interruption. Because her father had built the records, and she had organized them, and she had cross-referenced them, and she had annotated them, and she had triangulated every inferential claim with at least 2 independent sources. And Rourke's lawyer, a silver-haired man named Dalton, who was very good at his work and knew it could find the edges to push at, but couldn't find anything to push that held. She watched him try. She'd read enough legal arguments in the territorial codebooks during the 4 days before the hearing to anticipate the vectors of challenge, and anticipate the vectors of challenge. And every time Dalton found an edge, she walked him through reinforcement she'd already built for it. Not with triumph, without triumph, because triumph was a form of carelessness, and carelessness was what happened when you forgot you were still in the room. The forged signatures, the comma placement across every fraudulent document, Corbett's testimony about Corby's presence in Voss's office, the bank teller's figures, Piercy's certified land office copies, Lenora's testimony about Rourke's direct threat, the pattern across 7 families in 3 counties. One by one, the afternoon light moved across the courtroom's high windows. By the time she finished, the silver-haired lawyer had the specific quality of a man who has spent his considerable professional skill doing everything available to him and has not found it sufficient. She stepped down from the stand and walked back to her seat. Haynes called a recess. In the corridor, Calder was waiting. He'd been in the gallery for the full 4 hours. She'd seen him there at the edge of her peripheral vision, and had found it, in some way she hadn't expected, steadying. Not because she needed the steadying, because there was a difference between not needing something and not being glad of its presence. He didn't say anything about the testimony. He said, "There's coffee. It's terrible coffee from the clerk's station, but it exists." "Yes," she said, "please." They stood in the courthouse corridor with the terrible coffee while the legal machinery moved in the rooms around them, and outside, on the street, a crowd had gathered that had not been there that morning. because news in a territory travels fast when it involves the dismantling of something powerful. Wren says Voss has already left Dunmore, Calder said. Took a horse and some money and went. Didn't announce it. He knows the review will find him. She held the coffee mug. Does Haynes have authority to have him detained? Wren's already filed the paperwork. There are men on the roads. He paused. Rourke is still in Dunmore. Hasn't moved. He thinks his lawyers will handle it. She thought about the silver-haired lawyer's expression at the end of her testimony. He's going to be disappointed. You're sure? She looked at the mug. Then she looked at Calder. I spent 4 hours today presenting evidence that my father spent a year of his life building, and I spent 3 weeks reinforcing, she said. I know every number in that ledger. I know every cross-reference. I know which arguments Rourke's lawyer was going to make before he made them, because I made them myself at the kitchen table until I found the answers. She paused. I'm sure. He looked at her. Courthouse light fell across his face with the winter's particular quality, and the scar along his jaw caught it in a pale line, and she thought about 6 years alone on a mountain, and a brother named Joseph, and the specific discipline of keeping yourself from acting until the right action was available. Your father would be. He started. Don't, she said. Not unkindly. Not yet. Let it be finished first. He understood. He nodded and looked at the corridor ahead. They finished the terrible coffee. Haynes resumed the proceedings an hour later. He spoke for 20 minutes in the measured, precise language of a man who has been composing his findings carefully for 3 days while testimony was being taken, and at the end of those 20 minutes, Cassian Rourke's fraudulent claims against the Hartwell estate were declared void, the forged debt instrument was entered into the criminal record, and warrants were issued for Rourke, for Voss, for Randall Corby, and for 3 county officials whose signatures appeared in the fraudulent transfer documents. Courtroom made a sound that was not a cheer, something more complicated than a cheer, the sound of a space in which many people have been quietly waiting for something, and have now, collectively, received it. Elowen sat in her chair and listened to it, and did not let herself feel, quite yet, the full weight of the thing that had just happened. There would be time for that. The ranch still needed to be reclaimed. The other families still needed their cases formally reviewed. Rourke was still at large in Dunmore, and men like Rourke didn't accept outcomes until they had no remaining alternative. Still work to do. But the structure of it had changed. The impossible had become the possible, and the possible was now partially accomplished, and that was a different position than the one she'd occupied on an auction platform in Red Hollow's square 5 weeks ago. Stood. She picked up her father's ledger from the table in front of her, put his pen in her coat pocket. She walked out of the courtroom into the corridor where Calder was standing, where Wren was standing, where Lenora stood apart with her hands folded and her eyes on Elowen, with something in them that was not asking for anything, just watching, with the careful attention of someone who has paid a debt and is not certain yet whether payment has been received. Elowen looked at her for a moment. She wasn't ready to cross that distance completely. She might not be for some time, but she understood something about what it meant to carry a thing alone, because you didn't believe the people around you were equipped to help you carry it. And she understood something about the specific kind of courage required to drive toward a thing you weren't sure would be accepted. She nodded once. Lenora nodded back. It was not forgiveness, and it was not trust, not yet. It was the space before those things, the cleared ground where they might eventually grow, and that was enough to work with for now. Wren was already talking about the roads out of Dunmore, and where Rourke's men might have positioned themselves, and what the warrant service was going to look like. And Calder was listening with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting 6 years for this specific kind of conversation. And Elowen stood in the courthouse corridor with her father's ledger and her father's pen, and listened to the machinery of consequence beginning its work. Outside, the winter light was doing something particular. With the courthouse stone-making, it looked almost warm. She looked at it for one moment. Then she went back to work. Years later, people in Red Hollow would still tell the story of that winter morning, a young woman crying on an auction platform, while an entire town looked away. They told it the way people tell stories about things that shame them in retrospect, quietly, with the particular discomfort of a community that knows it failed someone, and has had to live alongside that knowledge ever since. But that was never the version that mattered. The version that mattered was this: the woman came back. Not smaller, not quieter, not reshaped into something easier to accept. She came back exactly as she was, with her father's pen and her father's stubbornness and an understanding of numbers that had dismantled a corrupt empire one entry at a time. She came back and she built something that outlasted the man who had tried to destroy her, something that protected families who had no one else to call on. The men who had laughed lowered their eyes when she passed. Not because Elowen Hartwell Calder had changed, because they finally understood what they'd been looking at all along, and the understanding, arriving that late, had nowhere comfortable to live. Some lessons cost everything before they're learned. The lucky ones learn from watching. The rest spend their lives trying to deserve the forgiveness of a woman who was never obligated to offer it, but did anyway, because grace the humankind, earned through suffering and choice, was something her father had taught her too.